talks that I've heard.
Happy medium? Okay. So tonight I'm talking about a death in 1923. And I've consciously avoided certain terms, both in the poster and in what I just said. So it's a death in 1923. And we'll go from there. So, Carrie Sanders was worried. She'd woken up that Sunday morning to find his half of the bed empty. That wasn't unheard of. Farming often got him up before her. He tinkered around the backwoods at all hours of the day. And this late in the year, hunting would drag him out of the house before dawn. A friend of his had been by in the night to see if he was there. So it was probably a hunting trip. The worry hadn't really set in until Sunday afternoon. It was 4 days before Thanksgiving, and she hadn't seen her husband in about 24 hours. She told the kids that he would get a talking to, a real talking to when he got home. The younger ones, daughters Lena and Blanche, and sons Sam and Harry, seemed to buy that. They seemed pretty oblivious to the whole situation. The two oldest girls, Grace and Esther, looked uneasy. She did her best to distract them. But as the sun set behind Dressler's Ridge, she knew something was wrong. It was a bad night, but the next day was worse. On Monday, November 26, 1923, children playing at lunchtime recess outside the Aqueduct Hollow schoolhouse came across a body jammed in a culvert. It was a man dressed in brown overalls and high muck boots. The body in the culvert was John Sanders, a 41-year-old farmer from A-Line. This was Carrie's husband. John's body was under the highway, a culvert under the highway. Hundreds of cars would have passed over him that morning on the Susquehanna Trail. The culvert was relatively new, just big enough to get stuck in. There was no blood anywhere, just a cold, lifeless body. Aqueduct Hollow is 2 miles south of Selinsgrove. It's about 8 miles from the Sanders farm in A-Line, about 11 if you're following 1923 roads. It's the place where the aqueduct that carried the canal across Penns Creek rejoined the west bank of the river. So zooming in here a little bit, that's the Sanders farm in A-Line. That's Aqueduct Hollow. Spinning faster than I expected it to. The hollow was a traditional hunting ground. It was a place where large crowds went for a picnic each Ascension Day in the late 19th century. There were sawmills halfway up the hollow at several points over the years. Most recently, Paul Moyer and George Try had rebuilt a mill there in 1922. After 1915, Aqueduct Hollow was a spot of frequent car crashes. Dense fog settled in the hollow at night, and the headlights of the first generation of cars weren't strong enough to pierce it. An old hunting cabin was there, just a little off the highway. It used to belong to the Penns Creek Rod and Gun Club. Now it was locked up for most of the year, stuffed with equipment left over behind by former members. Ira Spearing, a carpenter from Sunbury, used it like a storage container for his camping supplies. And in 1923, the hollow still had a one-room schoolhouse at its base. Kids from that school were out that day when they made their discovery. When the county coroner, A.J. Herman, arrived and got to work, he found that Sanders had been shot in the chest. A faint drag trail could be seen just a little higher up in the hollow, as if Sanders had been shot elsewhere and either made his way down to the culvert himself or was pulled down there. In In Sanders' pockets were $9.73 and a gun. This was a dangerous time to be alive. Sanders' body wasn't the only one pulled from culverts or ditches or embankments that year in the central Susquehanna Valley. It wasn't usually murder that brought them there, but rather the risk involved in driving in the early 1920s. This was a time when cars were regularly careening off the roads into trees, into passing cars, into derelict canal beds and railroad cuts. Bridges collapsed. Motorists tried to race trains and trolleys to crossings. General mayhem happened on the roads weekly. Selinsgrove had its share of these accidents, usually just beyond town, often at night, frequently aided by bad conditions. This was happening everywhere, of course. The scourge of traffic accidents was so bad in the 19-teens and 20s that insurance companies published pamphlets, little comic books, alerting drivers to the many ways in which they could get caught in automotive mishaps. So it wasn't unheard of that a man's body would wind up in a culvert. I think that's the third to last time I'm going to say culvert tonight, sorry. You came for the culverts are almost done. But this was something else. A few days went by in which the county sheriff and town constable, Francis Gemberling, made the rounds and asked the public for more information. Did anybody know anything? Eventually, 18-year-old Francis Campbell of Verdilla came forward to tell the district attorney that early that Sunday morning, he'd shot over the head of a man who tried to hold he and his friends up while they were driving in a car low in Aqueduct Hollow. The foreman, this is the birth certificate, the death certificate, by the way, pistol wound over left side and through chest and heart while holding up a party on a public highway. I'm not sure what the 197 means. The four men, said Francis Campbell, the four men were coming home from a dance at Coker's restaurant in Port Trevorton. So you know I like maps with things going on. There's a party in Port Trevorton. They're from Verdilla. They're coming home that night, around 2:30 in the morning. They would take Aqueduct Hollow to get home. Driving up the steep hollow, they found their way partially blocked by a truck loaded with furniture. This is 2:30 in the morning. Two men were a little further up the road, removing tires from a car that had been wrecked earlier in the day. Campbell and his friends had seen the wrecked car earlier in the day on their way out that night. They knew that that car belonged to William Leonard. They knew that neither of these men were William Leonard. So they turned around and they got out of there. They went to Lennox's house outside of Port Trevorton, woke him up to tell him about his car. He gave them a loaded gun, and they returned to the hollow to get the tires. They were apparently more up for adventure than William Leonard was. When they got back there, the tire thieves were gone. The tires were still there. One was loosened. But they soon saw two men coming down the road with a couch. It's about 3 o'clock now. 3:50. One of the men ran off into the woods while the other one faced them, shined an electric flashlight at them, and drew a gun. Ralph Longacre was driving the car. He tried to crowd the armed man off the road with his car. That gunman was too quick. He jumped over to the passenger side of the car. This is where Francis Campbell sat in the passenger seat, and he fired William Lennox's gun at the man. Longacre hit the gas, and the car kept climbing out of the hollow. Campbell's statement to the district attorney explained that if he had killed Sanders, it was for fear of his own safety and the safety of his fellow passengers. But if Campbell's shot had hit Sanders, why was he found in the culvert? Doctors who examined Sanders said that he would have dropped in his tracks with that kind of wound. But his body was found 30 yards away. That dirt-clogged revolver found in his pockets had no rounds missing. Sanders' left hand was clenched in what the press loved to call a death grip. It seemed plausible that he had clenched the ground or the root of a tree, perhaps, as he'd been dragged to the culvert. County investigators worked on the theory that someone had pulled him down through the brush. Ira Spearing, owner of the hunting cabin, said that property from inside the cabin had been strewn throughout the hollow. Spearing found buckets, dish pans, a coffee pot, aluminum ladles, and a kettle out amongst the trees. Inside the cabin, a lot of other goods had been bundled up in blankets, as if someone was going to haul those out as well. It didn't take too much work for police to get more information. Everyone in this part of the state apparently knew two things, and two things only. This is my favorite joke of the night. One thing everyone knew, if you were making a top 10 list of go-to breakfasts in 1923, baked mackerel had to be on that list. That was for me. Secondly, if John Sanders had been up to no good, then a good place to start an investigation was by knocking on the door of John Fulkerod. He was a well-known friend of Sanders, 8 years younger, but seemingly a partner in whatever Sanders had going on. The pair had gone in together on a limestone lot in West Perry Township. They were seen walking the fields together. Now, John Fulkerod was picked up on suspicion of having robbed Ira Spearing's hunting lodge. John Fulkerod was not a poor man. He was a prosperous farmer who owned his own farm and had a housekeeper. He had been married to his wife, Mamie, since 1910, and they were fairly active in real estate transactions. This is the 1920 census that shows John Fulkerod and John Sanders living right next door to each other, just west of A-Line. Fulkerod bought his first car, a Buick, in 1915. This made the newspaper. He bought a Ford sedan in 1917. That made the newspaper. He bought a third vehicle, a Ford truck, in 1921. He'd had bad luck in the past few years. Fire had destroyed 2 uninsured barns in 1919 and 1922. Fulkerod had sold the farm to Carrie Sanders' father 2 years earlier. When Carrie and John Sanders took over the property, there was a large barn on the premises that apparently was kept under lock and key. Fulkerod explained to police that he had been in the area Sunday morning, but only because his truck had broken down. He said he'd been to Zeno Sprinkle's house in Freeburg. So that's nice. That's a nice, slowly revolving aqueduct hollow. So Fulkerod lived in Kramer. So that's his farm in Kramer. He said he'd been to Zeno Sprinkle's house in Freeburg for an hour Saturday evening. They did a little drinking, he said. This 33-year-old Fulkerod and a 63-year-old Sprinkle passing around a little of the hard stuff. Then Lizzie Sprinkle, Zeno's wife, chased John out of there. So he went to see John Sanders down in A-Line. Sanders wasn't home, he said, so he waited for about an hour. Sanders finally returned, and the two of them went to Port Trevorton to pick up a coal stove from Jim Stroh. It was 11 p.m. at night on a Saturday night by this point. But this was apparently not a long time to go pick up a coal stove. Jim Stroh was married to John Fulkerod's wife's sister, so this coal stove was being kept inside the family. When they arrived at Port Trevorton, Fulkerod said, John Sanders, passenger, said, keep driving, keep going north. I have business to attend to. As they approached Aqueduct Hollow, Sanders said, turn in here. They pulled in a little way up the hollow, and Sanders left Fulkerod behind the schoolhouse. When he came back a few minutes later, Fulkerod said Sanders announced that his stuff, quote unquote, was there. They should wait a little while before loading it up. unusually heavy traffic that night was out on the highway, this new Susquehanna Trail along the river. And so the men waited in the truck for 2 hours before doing anything. Sanders finally said, apparently, it's time. Fulcrud told the police that he said, take what you want, I'm taking nothing. At this point, I'll start to quote from Fulcrud's statement. It's a doozy. Sanders started to bring a couch up the road alone. A car came up the river road about the same time, and I yelled, John, get the hell out of there. When he saw it turn up the Aqueduct Hollow, he threw the couch on the hillside on his left by the schoolhouse and started down the bank to the right. And then that car came up, and someone in it yelled, hands up. By that time, some fellow said, what do you know about that? And by that time, the shot fell. And when that shot fell, the car started up the hill with all the power she had. Then I started the truck and pulled down to the state road and called for Sanders, but didn't get no answer. Then I drove down the state road to where it turns in at Hoover's Island Landing. I walked back and called him. I thought he had shot at the fellows in the car and had run away. I thought he went home, so I started towards port. I went to below Dundor. I think I have an animation of this. I went to below Dundor, then turned around and went back looking for Sanders again. Then I went out to Sanders' farm. I called his wife and asked him if he was home. I asked her if he was home, and she said no. Then I goes back again. It was 5 o'clock in the morning by the time I got there the last time. I had changed trucks and had Sanders' truck because mine didn't have a windshield, and I was cold. I stopped at the schoolhouse and hunted for Sanders, then I went down to the culvert and dipped a bucket of water for the radiator. I turned around and went to Sanders' house, waited for him until 8 o'clock, then I left for home. That's all I know about the story. I couldn't say if the body was there or wasn't there when I dipped the bucket of water into the stream. So Fulcrud had apparently cut a path through the brush to fetch water for an overheated radiator. The Evening News of Harrisburg took a generous view of the John Sanders affair. They called John Sanders a wealthy farmer of Snyder County. That paper suggested that Sanders might have been killed when he attempted to stop the robbery, a robbery that Fulcrud had executed. But more revelations were to follow. More revelations were to follow. When the Selinsgrove constable searched the Sanders 125-acre farm in A-Line, he found plenty to keep him interested. There were large cans of rye and corn whiskey mash in a storage shed. There were hundreds of empty bottles that smelled like whiskey in that shed. There were 57 cases of dynamite wired to the door of that shed. There was $1,000 worth of rope, picks, shovels, and wheelbarrows in that shed. And there was 1,000 feet of industrial-grade rubber hose in the shed. When Prohibition had started 3 years earlier, some people in this area started living double lives. The Selinsgrove Times predicted difficulty in Snyder County. Marion Shuck wrote that, quote, winter social life in rural communities like ours will be hard hit without cider, beer, or whiskey on hand. Just as saloons and clubs were driven underground in the nation's cities in the 1920s, so too was life in the countryside, divided between public-facing and backstage areas. Farmers with ready access to fermentable grains had little incentive, perhaps beyond their moral compass, to refrain from making booze. There was money to be made in the black market. As anybody who read a newspaper would have known at this time, transport was the tricky moment. When motoring mishaps or the highway patrol or a lack of discretion at the point of delivery could make all of one's work go down the drain. So there was risk. But a medium-sized farm with several outbuildings and a forested border could supply all the privacy that one needed to make alcohol. A-Line was an ideal spot for bootlegging. It was close to a major highway, but remote at the same time. Farms there had pockets of woods scattered across them. So John Sanders was a bootlegger. That explained the whiskey paraphernalia. The rest of those materials found on the farm, the picks, the shovels, the barrows, the rope, the hose, they were from one of the grandest public works projects in the area in the 1920s. These were road building materials stolen from the construction company that had just finished building part of the Susquehanna Trail. 19 months earlier, April 1922, the State Highway Department had opened up the bidding process for the paving of the Susquehanna Trail. There's an 18-mile gap left to be filled from Liverpool to Selinsgrove. This was the last link in the chain. After this, there'd be an uninterrupted highway running from the Maryland border to Elmira, New York. Many out-of-state contractors placed bids. The Peel Construction Company, a firm out of Baltimore, won the contract for the 12.1 miles of the route in Chapman, Union, and Penn townships. So this was from basically the southern limit of Selinsgrove down to the Juniata County line. Peel built an 18 feet wide road along those 12 miles, connecting it to the work of a Philadelphia contractor on the southern end of that job. They set up shop in Selinsgrove in May of 1922 and ordered all of their equipment from local channels. Hendricks & Sons Hardware won the main contract for supplying all of their goods. Hendricks & Sons is where the subway is now in town here. One of the first orders was a train car full of picks and shovels. Then the steam shovels arrived. Then the cement mixers arrived. Numerous trucks and hybrid motor wagons arrived. And then the work began. The road building process dictated that various units of the construction crew worked away from common depot points. So supplies and heavy equipment were kept at these sites, set up so that the work was always going on in front of them, and these were behind the progress. This way, multiple crews could serve the road at the same time. Aqueduct Hollow is one of these depot spots. Several spots like it further down the road where large piles of equipment would sit day and night. It would have been fairly easy for Sanders to steal equipment over the weeks and months that the road crews were at it. This surely was not the reason the Peel Construction Company soon declared bankruptcy after they finished the job on the Susquehanna Trail. And the Hendricks Hardware store was owed $25,000, which is just under $500,000 today. They took Peel to court. When all of this stuff was found on John Sanders' farm, his widow told the authorities, "Take whatever is yours. The children and I want nothing that does not belong to us. Father gave me the farm, and that is all the children and I want." She'd hung a black crepe on the door to mark her home as a house of mourning. But the solemnity of that scene was marred by the rumbling and the hissing of all the trucks that various stakeholders rolled up to her front door to claim the property that had been stolen from them. No still was found, but the district attorney noted that Sanders was likely part of a whiskey ring. The dynamite was wired to explode if Prohibition officials, presumably, came to raid the homestead. That didn't work. The uncovering of bootleggers like Sanders became a phenomenon in the 1920s, usually occurring when local authorities or Prohibition agents out of Philadelphia or Harrisburg suddenly arrested somebody. Whereas organized crime managed the production and distribution of illegal alcohol to the east, in the coal region and beyond, it seems that in Snyder County, rum running came through independent operators like John Sanders. The discovery of the booze, paraphernalia, and the stolen goods led local police to wonder out loud if Sanders might have been shot by somebody else in the underground economy. A rumor of other gunshots echoing through Aqueduct Hollow that night, even later in the night, took the heat off of Francis Campbell. Theories swirled. And the county court system was very busy. It had its hands full that autumn already. Just 2 months earlier, on a Sunday evening in September 1923, a 55-year-old farmer named Martin Diebler had been run over and killed on the road between Centerville and Troxelville. His neighbor heard the collision and hurried outside to see a car moving westward toward Troxelville. Edward Lepley, a 21-year-old who lived about a half mile away and worked in a silk mill in Sunbury, usually drove that road at the time. The district attorney sought involuntary manslaughter charges against Lepley. When Lepley went before the grand jury for that accident in December of 1923, this was happening at the same time that the John Sanders case was coming forward as well. So the Shamokin Dispatch is always like the rag of the area, the most splashy headlines. They love the dirt and the scandal. And so this is a thrilling, look at this front page. This is the story I'm talking about here. The Lepley, the Diebler death is down there amongst all of this misery and heartache from 1923. Dangerous time to be alive. A Snyder County grand jury decided not to indict Francis Campbell, agreeing perhaps with the newspaper verdict that Sanders got what had been coming to him, and that the chaos of that early Sunday morning in Aqueduct Hollow was indicative of the messy world of bootlegging. So Francis Campbell was released. John Fulcrud was next. In his trial, Fulcrud maintained that he had no idea that Sanders was thinking of robbing that hunting cabin. He claimed that the men went there to drink whiskey, that they spent 2 hours sitting in the bed of his truck doing just that, and that he was surprised as anyone when the couch appeared in the middle of the road. He did admit that when he saw the headlights of the Long Acre car, he yelled, "John, there's a car coming. Come on, let's get the hell out of this." Cross-examination brought that out. Fulcrud admitted that Sanders was generous with his whiskey. Several witnesses supported this, building the idea that Sanders kept Fulcrud as a loyal assistant to robberies by paying him with liquor. Fulcrud eventually admitted that he and Sanders were robbing the hunting cabin, driving a truck there to haul out the furniture. On their way out of the hollow with the furniture, they decided on the spot to steal a few tires while they were there. If they hadn't stopped, he said, they would have been well on their way south by the time Campbell's car arrived on the scene. Fulcrud was found guilty and given 4 to 6 years in the state penitentiary. He served just 23 months when he was pardoned through the efforts of the county judge who had sentenced him. When he got out of prison, he and Mamie moved up to Watsontown, and he worked in a furniture factory. Before the year was over, 1923, the media buzz about the Sanders killing was silenced by the outright frenzy over another suspicious death. This was on the opposite side of town, in Happs Woods. It involved a love triangle, a shotgun blast to the head, and national press attention. But that's another story altogether.